Do you like what we do here? I would assume so if you're listening to this. We have had a good year for growth this year. We've had substantial growth on all the podcast feeds with new subscribers. We have the new YouTube channel with a bunch of new subscribers there too. But we want to carry this over into 2026 so we can continue to provide high quality entertainment, high quality news, high quality reviews, and all that kind of stuff. So what we're asking for going into next year is, if you have the ability, we're not asking for a lot, you can donate. Go to ko-fi.com/MWP News and make a donation. Everything you do goes towards making sure we can do things. That way I can take days off work to go and cover things early, or, things of that nature. Go to events and talk about them early, see advanced screenings. All that stuff goes into that budget. On top of that, if you can't afford that, and I realize right now things are tough and things are rough out there. If you can't afford that, the easiest thing you can do is subscribe and rate. No matter what you use to get this podcast, you can subscribe. Just hit the follow button, hit subscribe, whatever the button is on your thing, and then rate us. Give us 5 stars. That'll help more people find us, and the more people find us, the more we can, the more we'll be able to do, and we'll be able to get more happening. You can also go to mwpnews.com and sign up for our newsletter. There we will have articles and stuff like that about what we cover on this show. And we will also be doing more gaming content on the YouTube channel. If we can get, with more subscribers on there, we can do more. And that's youtube.com/@MWPnews. And again, thank you for a great year for us. Next year will be better. One of the big issues that I had this year that preempted me from doing a lot of what I wanted to has been resolved with the issue with my car, and that issue has been resolved. So going into this next year, we should be a lot more smooth sailing, but we do need your help to get more people listening and get what we're doing here out there. So just subscribe, tell your friends, and if you have the ability to, and you have the money, and you want to, and you think we're doing a good job, and we've earned that, go to ko-fi.com/MWP News and throw us whatever you think we deserve. And thank you, and enjoy this episode. Okay, well, attempt 2. Welcome to Exploring Hyperspace Lanes. I am Adam. It is March 6th that I'm recording this, so I'm a little late. We're going to talk about The Last Order, the book that came out a few months back, set after the sequels, during and before the sequels as well. So let's just acknowledge something real quick. Star Wars as a franchise has done really well. Not just because of the movies being this thing that captured everyone's imaginations at 3 separate points in time, but also because it manages to expand the lore out with these other media books. I mean, Star Wars the franchise only has the staying power that it does, and was maintained its relevancy because of Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn back in the early 90s. And the Star Wars Expanded Universe has kind of built out into this behemoth ever since then. And all of that said, it's a really interesting kind of situation where one of the real pitfalls of the sequel trilogy that kind of has it in this weird place where it kind of is not exactly the most it's not as well regarded. And I think a good amount of that comes from the fact that we haven't had expanded universe novels set in this period. We've had Resistance Reborn, we've had some comics, we've had, things like that. but fundamentally, we are missing this deep, enriching look at what else was happening at this time, or what's happening immediately after. And all of this is to say, I don't think this book necessarily solves that problem. I think that there's too much Finn here. Because fundamentally, you know, what's that Stephen King quote? You know, if it's called its backstory, because if it was interesting, it would just be the story. That is kind of the way it is, where it's like, with Finn, we saw 3 movies of him kind of fleshed out into the form we got at the end. And I think JJ totally bungled the story at the end, because, like, let's go through Finn's arc real quick. So Finn starts out in Rise of Skywalker, not Rise of Skywalker, The Force Awakens. We start out, we have this character, he's a stormtrooper, he goes out on this mission, he's conflicted, he watches someone die, and he defects. He defects with Poe, goes off on this thing, and then immediately ends up in this battle with the Resistance, and he really doesn't have anything to do besides just, like, go with the Resistance. What else are you going to do at this point? So he does. He helps them out. They destroy Starkiller Base, and he faces off against Kylo Ren, gets his ass kicked, and ends up in a bacta tank. Then, let's skip ahead. I mean, really, it's like 20 minutes, but in the immediate aftermath, the Resistance is going to, the Resistance is attacked by the Empire, and we end up with the First Order, and Finn wants to leave. He wants to go off and just kind of live out his life in anonymity, but the ship is in peril, so what is he going to do? He's going to, it's not their fault. I mean, people are honking all around because some guy blew a red light and no one wanted to get hit. So he goes off, and he's now in the situation where he's now one of the few people who can help, save the ship and save the Resistance. So he has to go off with Rose to Canto Bight, and that entire sequence is what it is. But the important thing of this entire thing is he sees the wider world, sees he wants to make a difference, and sees he wants to join, which culminates in him going on to, the ship with Benicio del Toro, who is there as well, and Rose, and they face off against Phasma. He kills Phasma, and they move on. And that's where you get that moment where it's like, she calls him scum, he says rebel scum, and that whole thing is he has now accepted his role in this. Then we get to the Rise of Skywalker. And in the Rise of Skywalker, we have this moment where he is, we acknowledge several times in this movie, which is a really weird choice, that the Resistance is, like, the First Order is entirely, operated. These ships are all operated by abducted child soldiers, and it's people who are exactly like Finn, and we end up meeting Janna exactly like Janna. Janna had previously led a rebellion of stormtroopers, and that is kind of what this entire thing is about. Now, rather than him doing that, which is what kind of would have been the logical endpoint for his character in this trilogy, where it's like he reluctantly accepts the call to adventure, he full-throatedly accepts the call to adventure, and then he decides to, lead the rebellion of the stormtroopers who are going to then help, stop this. And from a story perspective, the reason why they don't do that is because there are too many of them on these ships. If all the ships are entirely manned by these people, then you can't have a rebellion of them, because it just completely destroys the entire third act of the movie, and it just doesn't work. Which I guess the solution would have been to not have that be the case, because it just ends up weird where it's like, oh, and now here, like, these are all people who were abducted and brainwashed. These are not people who are, willing conscripts, and that's kind of the big issue that I have with this. And I don't think we necessarily need to delve into Finn's backstory, because it's like, how did he get trained? I don't need any of that. And that, I think, is a little too much. Janna, on the other hand, is a much more interesting character, because she doesn't have much to do in The Rise of Skywalker. She's there, but I don't remember too much of what she does. She's just a character for Finn to relate to, for the most part, and she does help the final battle on Exegol. But I just feel like that's something that her backstory is interesting, especially considering she led this thing previously. So my issue is there are two main parts of this book that are just kind of entirely uninteresting. Finn's backstory, which, cool, I guess, which takes up a lot of time, and then also what's happening contemporaneously. And in this book, the contemporaneous portion is what's happening immediately after the Battle of Exegol, after, the destruction of, after the destruction of the First Order, or the Final Order, whatever the fuck it is. Palpatine's dead, everyone else is dead, there are still remnants of the First Order out there, they're going out and hunting them down. But the issue is that you have this book that's doing all this work. Why not just let it be Jannah and Finn going out kind of Mossad style to hunt down the remaining First Order people, and have that be the thing, and not be like, I get the appeal of making this a more of a focused look at, like, okay, well, they're gonna get revenge on this guy who made them who they are. But also, like, I think it would be better served if they went out there to try and, as a mission to, like, try and help other people like them. That probably would have been a better way to handle it. And I feel like what happened is the contemporaneous portions of this book, set after the Rise of Skywalker, are as weird as they are because of the inclusion of the Lucas Story Group, which is this new thing that was kind of introduced as this idea where it's like, hey, we're going to do this, what's it called? We're going to do this thing that's going to, like, streamline the storytelling, which is kind of the big selling point. Like, we're going to get rid of the old EU, which is with its tiered system. Now everything's going to be equally canon, and we're going to have the story group that's going to be there to make sure that there's really no plot inconsistencies between them, which I would say was kind of needed, because, like, if you go back and it's like elements of Heir to the Empire don't exactly mesh with the prequels, which is why Outbound Flight exists, and there's a whole thing. Like, they completely define the Clone Wars entirely differently from how the Clone Wars are portrayed in the movies, and that's okay, because the book came out 10 years before the Clone Wars begin in the movies, and you just gotta kind of, deal with that. It's a weird quirk of the canon. And that is kind of where I am on this. Where it's like, the entire difference between that and this is that they weren't as focused on what are we doing next in the movies and how can we make this, make sense in that regard. So there is no risk taken with Jannah or Finn. There is no risk taken with expanding the universe or explaining what's going on with the First Order or the Resistance or the new Republic or anything like that. Like, there are a lot of things that aren't really being explored or even looked at, and it feels very superficial and shallow. And that fundamentally is kind of the issue with why we don't have necessarily the sequel trilogy rehabilitation project that has always existed, where it's like, yeah, the original trilogy didn't really need it, but they expanded out the lore between the original trilogy and the prequels, where it's like we get Heir to the Empire, we get all the stuff that happened after, the remnants of the Empire, all that cool stuff that happens, all of that coming out between, episodes 6 and 1. And then, like, the prequels had a bunch of books that happened at the same time. Like, I remember being a kid and reading the Jedi Quest series, which took place between 1 and 2. You had, there were a bunch of other, novels set there, and then you also had back in, you had the Clone Wars TV show. And all of these things really serve to kind of bridge gaps in the story and allow people the ability to take this thing into their homes and really, like, commit to it in a way that was on the level of a child. Or an adult, in some cases, because they did have adult novels too. And that's the thing, is that this is missing that. Lucasfilm, in its current state, is missing that because it has this obsession with trying to appease the original generation of fans. Like, Dave Filoni is a huge Star Wars fan, and I'm not taking anything away from Dave Filoni. But the problem is, if we're going to sit here and continually just jerk off over the original trilogy, and all we're going to do is talk about how great the original trilogy is and set everything around the original trilogy. And it's like, oh, look, here's a Darth Maul show. Darth Maul's a character from the prequels that Dave Filoni fucking loves. And here's a story of him set between episodes 1 and 2, and between 3 and 4, which is like his favorite era to take place in. We just had the Bad Batch, and we just had the Mandalorian, and we just, all these things either right before or right after the original trilogy. And it leads to this issue where, we aren't getting back to what the current thing is with the most modern movies, which is the thing that these kids who watch this would have gone to see in theaters. And the thing is, too, even the movies that were coming out at the time weren't just the prequels. Out of the 5 movies that came out under Disney's, tenure running the studio, like, by the time we get to the end of May, half of the movies that have came out will have been about the time period in the immediate vicinity of the original trilogy. Because you have Solo, you have Rogue One, and you have The Mandalorian and Grogu. The other 3 are the sequel trilogy. And the idea that, like, the sequel trilogy needs this space, but, like, the Resistance show wasn't given the proper time to develop. It never got the chance to grow into a Rebels or something like that. And it's just kind of this weird situation they find themselves in, where it's like, why are people not glomming onto the sequel trilogy? It's not that the sequel trilogy is any worse than the prequels. I would say, like, movie for movie, I'd rather watch. I mean, but it probably is just I watched it when I was a kid. I probably rather watch the prequels, but, like, I you can't tell me with a straight face that the Rise of Skywalker is a worse movie than Attack of the Clones or Phantom Menace. You can't. It's not great, and there are a lot of elements of that movie I do not like, but it's at least competently made, and that's the worst of the 3. Like, it's just like, and I know that, like, the Rise is, like, the Last Jedi is divisive, and I know that I'm on the side that a lot of people disagree with. I really like The Last Jedi. There are elements I don't, but I do really like The Last Jedi. And it's like, you mean to tell me that, like, even if you want to say, like, you don't like the direction they took Luke in, you don't like the entirety of Canto Bight or anything like that, you're honestly going to tell me that this movie is not at least better than those 2? Like, you cannot put that movie lower than those 2 in a ranking. Or even, I would say, even Solo, lower than Solo. And therein lies kind of the issue, is that it's like, maybe the worst thing you could say about them is that they have no cultural impact in the same way we talked that way about Avatar. But, like, as I watch this, as we watch this kind of unfold, I'm kind of like, why have we not had an animated show set during the sequel trilogy? And part of the problem is the world of the sequel trilogy does feel very shallow. Despite all things, like, it does feel very, shallow. But, like, we need more books in this era. We need more stuff like that. And we need more comics. And we don't need comics based around Kylo Ren and Rey. And therein kind of lies the other issue here. Is that it's like, when we look at this period, and when we look at what they're really doing, it's like, the other key thing they keep fucking up at Disney is that they keep centering on the same 5 characters and the same 6 characters over and over and over again, to the point that it makes the universe feel very small. Because when we keep coming back to the Skywalkers, when we keep coming, like, when the Mandalorian ties back to Luke, to Ahsoka, to all of these other people, like, the question that I end up with is, what the fuck are we doing? Like, why are we, what's the game plan here? And I don't think that there really is one beyond, like, let's see how much money we can make. There's that review on Letterboxd that went viral about Star Trek Into Darkness, and it's like, this is a movie that made a lot of people in a boardroom, applaud and pat each other on the back and shake hands. And that's what Star Wars feels like here, where it's like, how can we monetize nostalgia? How can we monetize all this stuff? To an extent, they've managed to succeed. In a lot of cases, they've managed to figure out quite a bit, but they're still not quite the movie that we haven't gotten the true sequel era the way we need to. I think this book kind of is indicative of that, where, like, again, we're going back to the period either right before the movies or during the movies. We're not fleshing out after, and we're not taking these characters on adventures that we want to do. That I can recall off the top of my head, we have had one book that is set, like, contemporaneous to the sequel trilogy that actually fleshes out the story somewhere, and that is Resistance Reborn, set between 8 and 9. That's it. And that's a problem. Like, one of the morals, or one of the things that they kept saying in, The Last Jedi is let the past die, kill it if you have to. And that's Kylo Ren being like, hey, we don't have to continue doing the same cycle of behavior that has continually happened over and over and over in the universe. And yes, he's speaking from a place of the dark side, but realistically, that's kind of the path that Lucasfilm has to take. Realistically, the path that Lucasfilm has to take is going to be like, hey, let's stop fucking jerking off over the original trilogy, or even the prequels. And I know this has devolved into this is a really bad idea to put Dave Filoni in charge of the studio. But that's kind of where I am on this, where it's like, this book is kind of indicative of all the problems, where it's like, hey, look, we could have spent time, we could have made this entirely a Janna book. We could have made this into a Finn and Janna going off. But you're going into territory that we really don't need explored any further. I don't need Finn's backstory, because Finn's backstory is exposited throughout the existence of the sequel trilogy. We know everything we need to know about Finn's backstory. He was a stormtrooper. We don't need the minutia of his time as a stormtrooper. We don't need to know any of that. Like, that is all superfluous information. More information about what Janna did, way welcome. Very welcome there. But I don't need as much about Finn. And I'm not saying Finn's not an interesting character. I very much would like to see Finn carry on post Rise of Skywalker. But this is not that book. Because this book is too focused on making sure we can leave as many doors open as we possibly can for a future movie, or a future TV show, or a future animated thing, or anything like that. It's like, we don't know what we're definitively doing. And I wonder, too, it's like, we hear all these stories about, about Marvel and their secrecy, and how it's like things were in development without, people seeing other things. Like, I seem to recall that, like, Sam Raimi was developing Multiverse of Madness, but he didn't have access to see what was going on the set of WandaVision, which you're like, oh, that makes sense, because these two things are completely disjointed from each other, with only the most tenuous of threads. And that's kind of what it is. Where it's like, is that existing here? Where it's like, is there a level of secrecy to Starfighter that does not exist that exists and is not really the case for, most other productions? And if that's the case, is that being held back from the writers at the story group who are working on this? And if that's the case, then I really think we're making a serious mistake in how we want to handle this franchise, because it defeats the purpose of that. Because if the story group is treating all things equal, the way they purport to operate, if that's the case, then this book would have been able to delve further, more deeply into the world of the post Rise of Skywalker Star Wars universe. But I digress. We will wrap up there for today. Next week we'll be talking, or next week, or maybe 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about another book. But until then, have a great rest of your week.